Hi guys. So far we've been on the topic of natural selection. We know the scenarios and the general order of how it goes, right? I have variation, one of those variants is better suited, therefore it survives, and it's able to pass on its genes. Right before this, we talked about, okay, how do these populations get different types of variants, right? Through mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, and random mating. Now that we know what natural selection is and how it works, I want to talk about three different patterns of natural selection. So these are different patterns that can occur within a population. Before we get into that, let's talk about what's considered normal. Okay, a normal distribution is where the frequency is highest near the middle value and it just steadily starts to decrease towards each extreme end of the range. This is very common in grades. So if I look at this chart, if I have a population of students, the majority would be in the middle, and I would have fewer students on either extreme. An extreme would just be the end of the range. So fewer students have A's, fewer students have F's, but a lot of us are in the middle somewhere. So this is an example through biology. A medium-sized animal surviving more often than a smaller large one. So in a population, there just happens to be more medium-sized than there are small and large. Okay, so this is a standard that we're starting with. But some things happen in these populations, and if a scenario is there where it causes one type of variant to survive better than the other, we're going to talk about three different patterns that could arise. So one is directional. Just looking at this word directional, my mind is going to direction. It's moving in a direction. This is where I have an extreme phenotype that was once rare in a population becoming more common. So this dotted line in this picture represents my standard, my normal distribution, my original population. But one end of my extreme over here starts to become more common. It starts to have the advantage depending on the scenario. Therefore, the population kind of moves over in a direction. Next is going to be stabilizing. When I think of stable, I think it's starting to balance out again. This is where the intermediate, mediate, middle phenotype is favored and becomes more common. So this is my standard, right? The dotted line is still my standard. But notice here, my extremes, my two extremes over here are in danger. They're dying off really quickly, and my medium phenotype is the only one that's really surviving. So this is an example of stabilizing selection. And then I have disruptive. Think of disruptive as there's a big change. It's affecting kind of the whole shape of this graph. So this is where both extremes of the phenotype are favored. The intermediate one, the middle one, starts to suffer. So this is a scenario, again, my dotted line is my original here. This is my scenario where the two extremes happen to have the advantage, and my middle guy doesn't, and it starts to die off. So I can see visually how this graph is disturbed, right? It's nowhere near that normal distribution, and this is the most different graph I could see. So those are my three. Summarizing them here. Directional. One of my phenotypes, the extreme, is favored. So if these lizards, the longer the tail, the better they are to surviving, where the shorter the tail, not so much. So it's just moving in one singular direction. Here, this example is short tail messes up a cat's balance, long tails are dragging on the ground, so they're not really good. It's against both extremes here. But my middle one is going to be the only one that's able to really survive and it's favored. So I see it stabilizing going up in the middle. And then disruptive. Um, for this example, short tails keep predators from catching you on the ground. Long tails are good for balance in the trees. But medium tails, they're not really helpful here. So I have an advantage of my short tails, I have an advantage of my long tails, but my medium tails, not so much. So I see that starting to go down, and this graph is really disrupted. So this is my disruptive selection and showing you an example of all three. So in our notes, I asked you guys to kind of label these of what you thought they would look like. So just going through our answers, think about these again, double check your work, and let's see if we get these right. So in this graph, I see that my two extremes are favored, but my middle one is not. So this is going to be disruptive. Here I see my intermediate phenotype really favored, not so much my extremes. This is going to be stabilizing. This is another disruptive one. Here I see the population just move in one general direction. So this is directional. This is going to be stabilizing, directional for this one, and that's it. So hopefully after going through this video, we have a clear understanding of my three patterns of natural selection.